We have touched on a lot of issues, and I guess this is indicative of the fact that governance does cover so many issues and so many areas. I think we've got a great panel here, so I would like to open the floor to questions and discussions. So if you could just put up your hand if you've got a question to the panel or to the audience generally. Maybe somebody else in the audience might also want to answer some of the questions or enter the discussion. Maybe if you could just state your name and your organisation, and then the panel will respond.
Thank you, Nonna. I've just got a very generic question. My name's... Kara talked about your conflict around being company secretary. I'm really curious to know, why would you appoint a CEO as a director if they are conflicted? And I noticed that we have this conversation in Legacy as well, where there is a CEO who is a director as well. Why would we do it if there is conflict?
It's an excellent question. I mean, if I was a director on the board, I would actually want the CEO sitting right there with me because the decisions that the CEO makes in his capacity as management need to have consideration for what the board are actually liable for. So for me, if I was chairman, I would actually like the CEO to have the same liabilities and obligations at law as I did. I guess on the flip side, you do then have at points an inherent conflict of interest, but more often than not, the CEO is in the boardroom representing management and making recommendations to the board, and that's their role or their job. But actually having those additional obligations sitting there tapping him or her on the shoulder is not a bad thing, would be my response and my view. I mean, does anyone else, since we're asking the audience for answers, have anything to add? Or
I was just going to say that conflicts of interest of themselves. Sorry, Judith Fox, Chartered Secretary of Australia.
Sorry. I was just going to say that conflicts of interest are of themselves not necessarily a problem. It's how you manage them. So the idea that you can proceed without any conflicts of interest, I think, is some sort of nirvana that doesn't really exist. What needs to happen is that you have a conflicts of interest policy, that you've thought through the issues, that it's the board who puts together that policy and thinks through the issues. Obviously, the company secretary will be heavily involved in that process. And also then that you have a process in place for the ongoing management and disclosure of those conflicts of interest. And I just thought I'd also point to something that Kara was talking about with board papers. We've developed a whole series of good governance guides at Chartered Secretaries Australia, which you can find on our website. They're publicly available. And we have ones on board reports, and we deal there also with the tricky issue of tabled papers, which I think is a very big issue that you need to be careful of. With all the will in the world, there will occasionally be tabled papers, and they present particular governance issues. But yes, that absolute standardisation of board reports is very, very important, and we give you some guidance about how to do that. We also have other good governance guides on things like what are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to ratify, resolve, or note? What is the board being asked to do? It's hugely important to actually have great clarity around what it is that you're wanting your board to achieve. And there's a whole range of other areas that we look at in that section. And we've also got a section called Governance Foundations, which looks at roles, identities of stakeholders, your frameworks, being clear about what powers enable you to put in place certain things, delegations of authority, and also the tools you need, such as board papers, agendas, minutes, which are actually central to the management of governance as well.
So could you say an organisation again, please?
Chartered Secretaries of Australia. Thank you for that, Judith. I think, baby, if you could, and then I think Eva wanted to also make a point.
Yes, just back to the original issue. My name's... just picking up on one aspect of what you... Sorry? Can't hear me? That's unusual.
Just, no one's ever said that to me before. Just picking up on one of the things that you just mentioned, Cara, in terms of the CEO being a director, so that the CEO shares a level of liability, and you may want to take this as a comment, but it recently came to my attention that under the new WH&S legislation, the directors of not-for-profits who are not remunerated, which my directors certainly aren't, and I dare say a number of them are not, do not share the same level of liability as senior management. So I will end up in jail, but the chair of my board will not. And I'm just delighted about that.
Just to go back on that, I'm not sure if any of you are members of the. Obviously, I'm a member of the Chartered Secretaries Association, but I also am a member of the Institute of Company Directors. And their most recent boardroom report for April actually has a very interesting article on plugging the gaps in workplace laws, and it actually specifically talks about not-for-profits in there and the sorts of things that the not-for-profit board should actually be looking at with the harmonisation. So it might be worthwhile getting your hands on that, just for interest's sake.
Yeah. Eva?
I just wanted to make the point that I think the conflict of interest issue would become apparent if the board is not independent. I think having an independent chair and adequate independent directors would suffice to address the conflict of interest, and then the position of the CEO is what Cara describes, where you need to have the CEO there to inform but not influence the board. And I think that's what would distinguish and would address the conflict of interest issue.
I think you've got Patrick. Sorry, Charles.
That's it. Naturally, I'm targeting on Kerry on this. Not-for-profit. I've got 3 questions. Why the speed? That doesn't seem. I've always taken the view to get it right rather than try and push it through. The cooperation with states and federal. I mean, can a state kick up such a fuss that they can stall the whole issue? A bit like a COAG type of arrangement. And thirdly, if you could define for us this issue of between charitable activity and marketing for profit. In other words, selling bears or selling helmets or selling items for a profit. How they're going to differentiate between that, because that's where a lot of the charities gain their income from.
True. Okay, I'll start with the last one first. It's not clear, the distinction. They have said it won't include the School Lamington Drive, but they haven't talked about those types of activities that you're referring to. Part of the feedback on the first exposure draft was they need to be clearer about the requirements and where the line is drawn. They also say that if the money from, if you are doing a profit making, and if the money from the profit making is being directly attributable to your not-for-profit activities, that should be okay, but you're going to have to prove the money flow, if you know what I mean. You're going to have to show how it clearly goes from one to another. So you can still sell your bears or your ribbons or whatever, but you're going to have to make sure that it's clear where the money goes. So that was the last question. The second question was the state. They are doing this state initiative through the COAG process. It was on the COAG agenda last Friday. It certainly wasn't reported in the media because I think it's pretty low level compared to some of the other things they were reporting on. But the Minister did issue a 1-page media statement last Friday afternoon, which basically said, you know, we're all talking about this and we're all moving together and something like that. You know, the general thing you would expect. If a state, I don't know, let's say Western Australia, says, I don't want to be part of this, we've got some Western Australians in the room. I knew that was a Western Australian. They won't stall the whole process, but it might just make it difficult for organisations in Western Australia, and they will end up with duplicated reporting. So they'll end up with Western Australian reporting and Commonwealth reporting. So,
I'm sorry,
yeah.
just extension. Can the Parliament knock this legislation back? Let's say the Senate said no go.
Well, yes, they can. Less like they have the right to knock any legislation back, but I don't see it happening. And that links to your first question, which is about the timing and why it's all happening so fast. They haven't said why it's all happening so fast, but I can give an opinion.
Go for it. No one in the room.
Well, that's my, yes. When is the election? The public portal is due to become operational from 1 July 2013. So not-for-profits, in theory, will be lodging their financial information on the public portal sometime late 2013. And when's the election? Late 2013. I think they want to get some runs on the board, would be my personal opinion, before they...
Not too many votes.
And I guess just picking up on what Kerry said, talking to Susan Pesco yesterday, who's the interim commissioner for... she made it very clear that the government has allocated 53.6 million budget over 2011 to 2014 to this new regulation, and most of that money is not spent on the commission. The actual number of people and the actual expenses of the commission is very minimal percentage of this 53.6 million. Most of that is on the IT, on the new, on that new, you know, the infrastructure to capture the information, and this portal in terms of information is really not just affecting. It's not just for the commission, because it takes away the duplication. So all of your information will go on there, which means that the information that you might have been given to other agencies and other bodies, they will no longer be able to ask for that, but they will be accessing it through this portal. So this is, so I guess it's almost kind of inevitable that it will go ahead, because they've invested so much money, and also that the information strategy is such that the other departments will be very, very dependent on the commission and the up-to-date information that they will keep.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that all the information you lodge will be public. So they will be looking at, you know, which bits of the information are for public viewing and which bits you might just have to lodge because a government department or a government agency wants some information, but it may not necessarily be public. So, and that's part of the whole infrastructure that they're looking at.
There are certain types of organisations which have been the subjects of litigation, which have caused some angst within the tax community generally. The other thing is, there was a comment made about the wisdom or otherwise of having the executives on the board. In the charity sector, there is, I think, Cara, a good reason for suggesting that the executives are probably better not members of the board, although regularly there. And we discovered this morning that's commonly what happens in... the point being that with the large number, if we assume we've got experienced directors on the board with extensive corporate experience, those people are short of time and they're giving their valuable time to the boards. The reality is many charities have a large number of people who find themselves on boards because they are very giving of their time and don't necessarily have that experience. And they find themselves with spare time and they've been very extensive volunteers. For these people, a problem arises because on the one hand, they are members of the board. On the other hand, they've had extensive experience giving their time to the charity. That raises the issue of people volunteering aside from their board duties to undertake what in other circumstances we would describe as management duties, which means that without being paid, they confuse their roles, take on the role of managers, and having taken that role, then accept, which, I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name, but you identified the fact that the managers have a responsibility the directors don't, and the risks that the directors don't. Therefore, in some, and it's a matter of understanding the context, in some charities it's a great idea, I think, to have the kind of board Cara's identified. In others, there will be a context where it's probably better for the executives not to be on the board, and I think that this is an issue that probably needs some substantial degree of consideration. And I'll say no more because you may have a view one way or the other.
I would agree, and as I said, it really does depend on the organisation's, well, as we go back, vision and what the board actually needs to achieve on behalf of its members and stakeholders. And if you are having a person spinning wheels, not understanding the clear distinction between the board or the role of the director and the role of management, then that's not achieving what you need to achieve and making the best use of your time and resources. And as I said, I'm from the for-profit, very capitalist side, so it's very difficult for me to tell you what works for your organisation. But I would agree, if that's happening, then that would be something that you should look at.
Thank you for that. There's a question there. Hazel.
Yes, my name is Hazel Bridge, Legacy Australia. This is probably to both Tarani and to Kerry. Tarani talked about social outcomes, and that was quite interesting. I've already gone on to that website and had a look. Kerry talked about reporting on expenditure and governance.
And governance. So, not-for-profits like ours, like Legacy, the widgets that we produce are occasions of service. So, I mean, and I wear another hat as chair of a local health district board. And of course, we report not only on our finances, but also on our activity and the type of services that we offer. And that's going to become very important because we're going to be funded on the basis of our activity shortly. So, is there anything in the legislation to actually say that we have to report on what we actually do and the occasions of service? Because in Legacy we're faced with an issue of an ageing widow population. So to some extent our service activity is possibly going to decline in one area but pick up in another area. So I was interested if that's been addressed at all by the ACNC.
Certainly in the Productivity Commission report, which is what was before the ACNC was formed, there was a recommendation that outcomes be reported on. And that was a very clear recommendation. In the Treasury work and the ACNC work, it is not so clear. There's not a black and white statement saying that. Having said that, the portal that they are creating has standard templates in it. So depending on where you fit, and I'd guess Legacy would be in the top tier and hence have to do everything, there are boxes for you to report on your activities. And it doesn't specifically say outcomes. It tends to use the word activities, and they're like narrative boxes. So you basically just fill in from either your annual report, your board report, or different parts of the areas that they're looking at. But there's no specific black and white statement on outcomes. But does anyone else have any view on that?
Tarani, did you want to?
It's not mandated, but I would recommend that you do measure outcomes, because finite resources need to be used effectively, and measuring outcomes and looking at that on a regular basis gives you a measure. So, with some not-for-profits, an example would be if you had an employment services division. This is not the best, but we recommend, if the activity is the number of job placements that you put through, measure that on a regular basis, measure the effectiveness of each site that you've got that's doing that, the number of people that work in that group and how many they do. Like each of those measures, I mean, obviously you need to choose the right amount of measures and which ones, but they will help you measure the effectiveness of your operations. But it isn't mandated. You're not forced to report on that stuff yet, I don't think. And it's just more an internal thing to add that rigour that you might want in your operations for your organisation.
Just let me add something to that though. Whilst it's not in anything we've seen in the ACNC or the Treasury work so far, The Australian Accounting Standards Board has a project entitled Service Performance Reporting for the private not-for-profit sector specifically. They're looking at developing a standard, and if they do develop a standard, it will be law. They've never before developed a guidance they've never before developed something that's non-mandatory, but we are certainly recommending that this not be mandatory, that it should be non-mandatory. We haven't seen it yet. Being on the consultative group for the AASB on that project, we've seen lots and lots of research papers coming out of our ears, basically. And there might be other people in the room that is also on that task force. And they're due to issue some proposals in this space by the end of this year. So I think they prefer the mandatory route because they've never issued anything that's not mandatory, and therefore they don't really have a process for doing that. We're trying to push very hard on the non-mandatory route because we think for many not-for-profits it will be burdensome. And I mean, I'm not saying what they're doing is a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. It's best practice stuff. It's stuff that people should strive for. But is it stuff we want to see in a legislated mandatory standard? I'm not sure.
Got a question over there.
Carrie, my name's... I'm a board member and also the chairman of our fundraising committee. We also introduced teddy bears, by the way. And now they were very profitable. We make profit on that. My difficulty is tracing the sale of a teddy bear to some kid going to school or to university. It's got to be as simple as possible and straightforward as possible. I should imagine just coming from, say, the fundraising accounts that we hold into our supporting accounts, which clearly show where the money's gone from that, should be sufficient. Would that be adequate? No?
Look, it's just not clear. There's been some suggestion that you actually have to have separate legal entities, which we said that we did not think that was necessary. I think when they first brought this ED, this exposure draft out, we go back to the budget last year when they first announced it, and it was going to apply from 1 July 2011. But we only had some draft legislation, I think, in June 2011, and it was going to apply in July. So it was only last week or the week before that they actually did a media release and said, well, no, we won't apply it from 1 July 2011. We'll apply it from new ventures undertaken from 1 July 2012. So we haven't yet seen... There was a lot of criticism on that first document because it wasn't clear and there were holes in it. So we haven't seen the next version of this, but we should see it. They told me last week that it should be about 3 or 4 weeks away. So I think we'll be clearer when we see the next version of the document, but certainly, having to do separate legal entities and transfers, didn't sound right.
It not only sounds right, it doesn't sound right, it sounds terrible.
Yes.
I mean, our fundraising is largely through our own efforts by selling things, and, that's clearly traceable to what we do. I think it's just a nonsense trying to... Maybe the government will replace the funds that we raise through our own efforts as compensation. Do you think that might occur?
Thanks for those comments, because it's really useful hearing those comments, because it helps when we get to submission process and that sort of thing that I've heard for some people, head down in the industry.
Got a question of...
My question has 3 parts. Has there been any thought of compensation to the not-for-profit organisations for the compliance regime that's going to be put on us? I suspect no. The second part of the question is, will there be standardised reporting periods? Across our organisation, I suspect there's a myriad of reporting periods, calendar year, financial year, and then some in between that. And the third part of the question was single entity registration. Major concern for Legacy is that we are 49 or 50 entities, all with DGR entitlements, all with our own ABNs, and we'd like to keep those.
The first question is I've never heard the word compensation. First answer. The second one was the reporting periods. Yes, there will be a standardised reporting period. We certainly objected to a standardised reporting period in our submission, but the feedback I got from Treasury last week is there will be a standardised reporting period. However, all those organisations that currently exist, with whatever reporting periods you currently have, will effectively be grandfathered. So you can keep your reporting periods. So any new organisations that form will have to be a 30 June year end unless you apply to the Commissioner for a different period. And the Commissioner has said that they will be fairly lenient with that, so I'm not sure what that means. Your third question was on single entity registration. The way that I read the document and the way that we responded when we did our submission is that every entity that has DGR status will have to report. Now that's not the way it works for corporations law. If you do consolidated accounts, you can, if you meet certain conditions, you can get out of reporting. But the way I read the proposal is that every entity will report. Now, where we have raised things with Treasury that are problems, we do hear we do hear from them that the Commissioner will, send in an application the Commissioner will consider. So I think the Commissioner is going to be considering a lot of things in the first 6 months of being appointed. So, whether there's some flexibility with that, don't know. It's all going to depend on, how flexible the Commissioner is going to be, because there's lots and lots of organisations with the same issue as you.
As I mentioned earlier, this came up with a discussion with Susan Pascoe yesterday, who's the interim commissioner. One of the issues that she commented on was the reporting period, and obviously it's quite an issue in this sector because a lot of the organisations report on the calendar rather than financial year, and she said that she will have some discretion in that, provided that there is an application to her. I also asked the question about the consolidation versus the individual entities, and she said that she perceives that she would have some discretion to grant, for some organisations such as Legacy to perhaps present consolidated report rather than individual, but she wasn't really quite sure where that was going, but that was an issue that has been brought up, and she was very much aware of that.
One positive thing I heard from Treasury, we did actually push back about the 4 month. They had a 4 month period for reporting, which companies, not-for-profits that are companies, do have a 4 month period to allow for their reporting, but there's lots of state and territory governments that have a longer period than 4 months. So they did indicate to me that they were going to have a reporting period allowed for 6 months. So now we have to wait and see, but that was their preliminary message to me, is that they had looked at the reporting period and were going to extend it beyond the 4 months. in order to accommodate all types of entities, not just companies.
David, I believe you've got a question.
It leads in very nicely to my question, and I'd just like to make the audience here who perhaps aren't familiar with Legacy that we are made up of 49 individual and autonomous clubs that have come together now over nearly 90 years. Those clubs do act very autonomously and report to the government now independently. The comment that was made by Eva, I think very strongly, was about organisational culture and how that takes a long time to develop and a long time to change. That organisational culture which exists between the autonomous clubs to make what we are on a national basis will not change overnight. The whole issue of speed and with regards to the implementation, I hear, needs to be, the decision makers here, including the politicians, must be cognizant of these very clear corporate governance principles which they are looking to enhance, and should not be conflicting against those with inappropriate, I guess, consideration of those fundamentals. I think as far as we're concerned, if they did push on with that single entity reporting for an organisation, and there are other organisations like us, it would be devastating in terms of our existence and that cultural basis on which we stand. I don't know whether I've got a question, it's a statement, but if there is somebody in the audience who can comment on that informatively, then I'd be very appreciative of it.
I'll just make a comment on that, and I think Kerry did mention it. What is of interest in the whole process is that the government is explicitly saying that this is going to be a principles-based approach, and we've seen everything but the principles. So, you know, and I think we've mentioned, we've mentioned that in our submission as well, and I'm sure the Institute did as well. I think if we are going to be if we are developing a principles-based framework for better governance or good governance, I think it is fundamental that the sector has input in defining those principles. And then let's create a framework based on those. So I find the process that this is happening bizarre.
Good word, good word.
And I'll stop.
Okay, Peter? Peter and then...
When you talk about the process, Peter, when you talk about the process, I think to get this into context, I would like to ask the panel, what issues do they think the government is actually trying to solve by doing this? What's driving them? Because if you understand what's driving them, that's the only way you'll have a sensible debate with them.
I mean, my immediate reaction to that is they want to install public confidence in the sector. They believe public confidence is lacking, and this goes all the way back about 5 years ago to a report that was in Choice magazine. Does anyone remember that? Judith remembers that. And it was fairly damaging, the report in Choice magazine. And then we had a Senate economics inquiry, which I met Judith at, I think, for the first time. Then we had a productivity commission, and even before that there was definitions of charities floating around. So yeah, I think that it seems to all go back to this Choice magazine article back in 2005 perhaps, or and it's all about public confidence in the sector. That's my view.
And in the exposure draft, it was also mentioned that the objective is to reduce red tape.
Yes, of course.
And make our lives easier, really. That was the other thing that was mentioned. Sorry.
Thank you to everyone on the panel. This is the sort of discussion we clearly need to have more of. But I just wanted to follow up from David's point, because I wasn't quite sure his question was quite answered. Is there a sense that there will be a drive to consolidate charities into single entity registration? Is that what you're seeing as the, that's sort of being encouraged or preferred, or are you pretty confident that an organisation like Legacy and many other charities who operate at community level can continue to register their entities at a community level with their own separate DGR status, their own separate ABN, and therefore provide their own annual information statement to the portal?
I mean, if you've got 49 entities that want to provide information to the portal, that's great, but it's a hell of a compliance burden for Legacy.
Well, we do it now, and the benefit that it does provide is actually empowers people in their local community to have local control, local trust with the people who are providing funds out of their local community, because they're supporting people in their local community. So my point would be, and this is maybe something you can take back if you get a sense they want to drive to single entity registration, is that the people that we support have more trust and awareness in dealing with local people. If we were to centralise all that into Canberra or somewhere else, I suspect the level of trust would actually diminish because they're more further disconnected from the people that are making the key decisions and providing that governance.
I don't think their intention was ever to make organisations fold into one national body. I think their intention really is about providing more information to the public to restore public confidence. And yes, the duplication and red tape stuff is also there. But just say I was a person in Western Australia and there was a Legacy box or whatever, and I actually wanted to know some information about this organisation. The intention of the portal is that I could go into the portal and say, Legacy Australia, in Western Australia or something, and it will pull up and provide me information about my local community Legacy organisation. If I wanted to know, and if you're a part of, do you currently do a consolidation? No. Okay. And whether they want consolidation information or not, that's not the realm of the ACNC or Treasury. That actually comes back to accounting standards. So we just park that for a minute. So it will be linked to your ABN, it will be linked to your DGR status, and a person who's looking for information about Legacy in WA can go to one place. If they're looking for information on Legacy in Queensland, they can go to the same place. If they're looking for information on Legacy in New South Wales, the same place. Type in what they're looking for, what location they're looking for, and information will pop up, as well as a link to your website. I don't think it's their intention.
I just thought I'd come back to the question of what's motivating the government, because it's a little bit muddied, but it's not all negative, and it's important to understand that. There are a series of inquiries over a decade in which the not-for-profit sector itself kept saying we would like a dedicated regulator and we would really like to actually have our regulatory needs attended to. We are not the same as the for-profit sector. And you might have heard of someone called Sue Woodward. She was at the University of Melbourne in the Centre for Corporate Law and Securities, and she did a landmark study of the not-for-profit sector. She went out and did research with not-for-profit organisations, and it came back very clearly that everyone wanted a dedicated regulator and people wanted a sort of national regulatory framework. Lots of not-for-profits, for example, take the form of the company limited by guarantee because it allows them to operate nationally as opposed to incorporated associations where you can only operate on a state basis. And with the internet, of course, everyone wants that capacity to operate nationally as well. So, to its credit, this government was the first one to actually get the idea that the sector itself was looking for a dedicated regulator and a sort of dedicated regulation. But unfortunately, that then got muddied by that choice article and this idea that somehow the sector was badly governed and needed to be heavily regulated to do the right thing. So two strands have become entwined that are actually coming from completely different perspectives. And all of us who are making submissions are trying to get the government to unpick those two strands because it's a wonderful aim that we should have a dedicated regulator. And what everyone is looking for is ultimately a streamlined regulatory framework where the compliance burden is less. But what we're seeing coming out in all the exposure drafts and the consultation papers is actually additional compliance, a leaning towards heavy regulation as opposed to principles, all the things that the sector is not wanting and that would be absolutely terribly onerous for the sector. And there's also a terrible confusion between the idea of needing to regulate the sector, as if somehow it's a problem that needs fixing, and the idea of enhancing reporting and disclosure, which allows the public to have much greater clarity as to what you're doing and how you're spending money and how you're achieving outcomes. So I think it is really important to engage in the reform process and to keep taking the message to the government that actually the not-for-profit sector is doing really well. It's a marvellous, addition to the Australian community, to social values, to the economy. It is not a badly governed sector. There are not-for-profits who need assistance, who need training and education, and the new regulator is going to have a very strong education role, not just an enforcement role. But there's a big difference between regulation, making you do the right thing, that's not what's needed, and reporting, which is what's needed, which gives everyone much better access to information about what you're doing. So I think that's a really important point to keep making, and do get engaged in the reform process, because some things have got a bit muddied along the way.
Thank you for that, Judith. We've got time for one more last question. Alan?
Thanks, Nonna. Alan, is there a suggestion? I think this is to Kerry. I'm sorry, Kerry. You're being picked on. Is there a suggestion that there's going to be some sort of uniformity in terms of structure, legal term, legal sort of a legal entity, legal form? Because at the moment there's companies limited by guarantee, and then there's incorporations. Yeah. I'm not too sure that the technical term. What's the story there?
The story is that the ACNC, where an entity is born and dies, will be, if you're a limited by guarantee, it will be ASIC and Corporations Act. If you're in state registered, it will be your state registration body. It will start there, so you'll be incorporated under there, but as soon as you're born, and hence you then have obligations, at the moment, if you're a charity, you then move over to be under the ACNC. And all your reporting obligations is under the ACNC as you're alive, and when you die, you go through deregistration process back in the original organisation that you, under the original legislation that you were created under. So that. So basically, so if we think of a limited by guarantee, yeah. The idea, as I understand it, again, it hasn't been clear. As I understand it, the idea is that you would still be a limited by guarantee under the Corporations Act, but then they would, defer all of its powers to the ACNC. So all the sections in the law will not be relevant to you anymore. It will be what's in the ACNC legislation that will be relevant. So and that's what will forever be relevant until you wind up. And then you go back to the corporations law and you wind up under the processes under the corporations law.
The reason I ask is that I was confused about whether there's two separate reporting obligations.
No, there won't be. There'll only be one, but it might take us some time to get one. Because if we're talking limited by guarantees and ASIC, that might happen fairly quickly because it's still under the Commonwealth. But if we're talking about the state reporting, the state will have to go through their own legislative process to remove your reporting obligations under the state so that your reporting obligations are under the ACNC. And that's when the whole state process comes in and getting agreement for that.
And what you said about that is that that's the no pain, no gain issue, isn't it? If Western Australia doesn't, for example, if they don't get on board, for example, then these guys have got possibly 2 reporting obligations for as long as it takes to either Julia or Colin to get removed. So I know which one's more likely. Yeah, so that's likely to happen.
Well, I don't know.
Who knows? Yeah.
Yes. And that's why we were very keen to push the process back. Let's give it time to happen, and let's, as you said, get it right first time, rather than have some short-term pain. If it takes 2 years to sort out the states, let's give it 2 years to sort out the states, and let's do it all at once that's what we're proposing.
Okay, there's a question over there.
Thank you. It's not quite a question, but an observation from within the sector. My name's and I was intrigued by this concept of trying to force everybody to have the same year-end reporting date. What's particularly apparent in the organisation I've been working with is that a lot of donation dollars tend to be driven by tax year. And what that means is that the month of June we will raise approximately 25% of our annual income. So to have a year-end on 30th of June means that April, May, in fact right now we're just finishing our budget preparation to go to the board before we know what 25% of our yearly income is going to be. And to mandate a period like that, while it might seem logical from a for-profit perspective, have it all aligned to tax years and 30th of June, perhaps for the non-profit sector, the 30th of June is just the wrong time. If we want to have good management and we want to be informed about doing our annual budgets with the knowledge of what's happened at the June giving time, which tends to be a common trait amongst a lot of non-profit organisations.
Yeah, no, good point, David, and that's why we were dead against mandating. And you know, only two years ago, under the corporations law, they actually brought in more flexibility for people for corporates to change their year ends. They brought that in 2 years ago, so that ASIC's permission is no longer required, and all that you need to do is have a shareholders' resolution to move your year end to a more suitable year end. So on the one hand, they're giving more flexibility, and then we get the other thing with mandating and less flexibility. It just doesn't feel right.
Thank you, Kerry. And look, it's 4 o'clock, and I know there's a lot more questions, and we could have a lot more discussions, but we've been given 2 to 4 for this particular panel session. Look, I'd like to thank everyone that came today. I'd like to thank Legacy that I guess gave us an idea of doing something like this, and for obviously being at the leading edge of the charities and being very much aware that, you know, that there are these changes and that they need to be addressed, and willing to expose your organisation to, I guess, to some change management and to this kind of public discussion. I'd like to thank all of the other guests that came here today, but most of all, I'd like to thank the panellists. I'd like to thank Kerry. I'd like to thank Cara, Tarani and Eva for wonderful contribution this afternoon, and I'd like to thank them in the usual manner. Thank you very much.